And we are live. I am Dazza Greenwood, starting off this second episode, I guess you'd say, of our Hangout series leading up to the W3C blockchain workshop, which we'll be hosting here at the MIT Media Lab. And I'm joined by um, one co-chair so far, and I think Neha may be a few minutes later, and we may very well see Doug from the W3C as well. But I wanted to just kind of dive right in with you, Dan. If you could introduce yourself and then just talk a little bit about where are we at in the process now. Just about to start as a program committee to whittle down the topics where people can find the content, which is available on the web now, and then with that update, I want to just go through a little bit and start to foreshadow the work of the workshop, which will be to identify ideally several good candidate areas for where standards may be ready to begin work on with respect to blockchain, where interoperability would be needed with some kind of interface point with the web. So first off, hey Dan, who are you, and where are we at right now in the process?
Okay, so Daniel Buckner, I work for Microsoft, specifically with the blockchain identity work that we have underway with the companies named in our recent announcement, BlockSec Labs and Consensus. So, obviously that's an area of interest for me. And I mentioned it in my position paper, as some of you mentioned other interesting things that you guys want to do with blockchains and how they could apply to standards. So, the process that we're going through is we're evaluating these position papers for strengths in certain areas. Obviously clarity in topic or the set of topics they bring up, the technical aptitude that's displayed, and supporting any positive or negative claims in those position papers. And the reason why we're assessing it with that criteria is so we can help identify topics that aren't just pie in the sky or blue sky type things. We want to make sure that the topics that we focus the agenda on for the meeting are things that people have thought really in depth about, and that maybe multiple people are thinking about, so that obviously we can not waste people's time and ensure that the group has maximum buy-in on the topics that are picked. So right now there's a process, I think that it was just sent out here today, about a spreadsheet that we have that we're asking for all the PC members to interact with and essentially take chunks and review under the criteria that we've laid out. So that's kind of the process. We're going to be explaining that in further detail tomorrow. Specifically, Neha and Daza are going to go over the process, all the aspects of it, and we should, if you want to understand what we were asking of you and what we hope that you help us with, definitely jump on the call tomorrow. That's at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern, and I sent out the iCal file today for it.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate that. And looks like we are joined by, the first among equals in this co-chairs group that we have, Doug. And Doug, do you mind introducing yourself and just your role in this as in a sense, the person convening it for the W3C?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. So my name's Doug Sheffers. I work for W3C. I've worked for W3C for about 9 years. I've been involved in a lot of different things at W3C, from mostly to do with web apps and graphics, but also in web payments and annotations and a number of other areas. So I try to find things. Part of my role at W3C is to find things that that are ripe for standardization, that can add something to the platform, and that the platform is ready to receive, that developers are asking for, that the technology stack will afford abilities to use, and just find these little building blocks that we can add to the web platform.
Awesome.
But things like audio and touch events and a number of other things are things that I identified and I brought into W3C. And one of the things that I'm looking at now is blockchain, and I think that there's some potentially really profound things that some aspects of blockchain could bring beyond payments, but including payments. to the platform, and I think it's going to be imperative actually that we solve how wallets are handled, for example, and what that means for identity and for payments and all these other things. And this is going to emerge in the next few years as I think going to be one of the big things. But then also just the notion of some blockchain primitives that could transform the web experience. So we think that it's very early, and we want to be sensitive to the community itself to see what the blockchain community wants to do and how that might impact client side web standards like the WC focuses on, or interchange formats, which is another thing that W3C works on. Um, and so this is really just a speculative um, beginning look at what blockchain can bring to the web, and conversely, what the web what would need to change about the web in order to enable blockchain use cases.
Got it. Um, Am I on mute? Oh, no, I'm not on mute. Okay,
No.
thank you. And so one of the things I took the liberty of just bringing up here is this um, encapsulation, basically, of what the conference is about from a W3C perspective. And so it is a W3C that's convening this, and the question is very much, as you said, is your role is identifying, could this be a topic W3C would want to work on? And so to help answer that, part of what we're looking to identify at the workshop and leading up to the workshop is it ripe, was your word, good word, for standardization or standards work? And so one of just to crisp that up, is there a strong problem statement? There would need to be a strong problem statement that was, articulable and sufficiently agreed for it to be ready for standards work. Is there a clear starting point or an agreed starting point? And have we identified, a sufficient commitment by a sufficient set of the stakeholders to make who would actually do the work? Those would be the three kind of top level summarized versions. There's a lot more nuanced decision making that goes into it, of course, but just to get people into the framework. And for focus and fit for the W3C, maybe ready for standards, but for W3C types of standards, that's a subset of all standards. And so it would be looking for web-oriented standardization or need for interoperability or common interfaces, common approaches, and so that would be thinking about client side, kind of browser oriented things, the explorers and stuff we've talked about on this hangout and is all over the list. Thinking about data and formats is, comes up. HTML is a terrific way to structure data and information. And you've got communication protocols, which is not so much a W3C thing, but that's another common area related to the web. So now I feel as though I've done my duty to at least. Now we've said it. Okay, so now let's have some fun and talk a little bit about what are we hearing so far. We've got this great stack of papers that's available for everybody to see, thanks to Doug, who did the work translating them into a common, accessible format. And look, you can get them linked right from the event site, which is we'll say at the end. We start to look at them. What are some ideas that you've seen, maybe Dan and Doug, for areas that could fit the bill? What areas could be ripe for standardization that we might want to talk about and refine at the workshop?
Daniel, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, one recurring theme, obviously, I just mention it first because, I think even on all our calls, identity was a big one, right? Because it kind of has its fingers in so much of what we do on the web and our interactions, regardless of whether it's user to user or user to application or service or even with inanimate objects. I think that's a huge piece. I think one other one that we see is blockchain primitives. I think there is a desire to be able to have APIs in the browser that can formulate transactions and be able to interface with blockchains. I think those are probably the two most frequent that I see, other than, and that would fall into the monetary use case obviously as well, because if you can formulate a blockchain transaction, you can definitely send value tokens to people. The last one is difficult. I think the primitives is a difficult topic because we're still pretty early on in the life cycle of blockchain, in the lifetime of this technology, that the different chains themselves and organizations that are open sourcing code to create chains still haven't themselves decided on that TCP cross ledger interface. And so is that going to come along? I think at some point those folks will do that. Should we sidestep that as browser vendors and say, hey, we could write a layer that enables this, or we could write adapters for individual chains? Not sure. The identity stuff is, and that's a very direct way of forming a standard, right? You actually take the technology, you take whatever its APIs are, bind top-level web APIs to them. The identity stuff, like other things that are possible, represent more of an indirect thing, where you don't actually have a browser relying on the very low-level bits of a blockchain. It's more like you create a layer that does all of that, resolves that, and then expect the web implementations to be able to leverage it, which is quite a bit easier to do because you don't have to have this broad agreement among all these actors and these primitives to be able to be able to standardize. So maybe that's an easier avenue for standardization.
Mm-hmm. And just to what I get from the last insight you said is, in a sense, the agreement you need is sort of only one thing from everybody when you're binding a set of APIs, which would be, what is the one thing that we would bind our API to, and thereby you get the world of interoperability in theory. So we shall see. I'm glad that you basically started to just set the stage of some of the dynamics and some of the different types of kind of like penetration into standardization that may be available to us, and selecting some of them, pre-selecting some of them, or at least weighing some of them before the conference would be really great to get a head start on that. So let's see how far we get. So now, the heavyweight champion of standardization, Doug, do you have some thoughts? You live and breathe standards all day long. You've seen them work and you've seen them not work. What have you seen so far that was got a good kind of profile, a good heat signature for orientation of our conversation, to make it the best workshop we can?
So I'll be honest, I haven't done that many workshops at W3C. I tend to focus more on more community development. In other words, just bringing people together through W3C community groups or interest groups or things like this, and fostering things that way. And I think that just as an overall strategy, I think we're going to have to do that anyway. Like, once we've sort of established a sort of set of things to explore at the workshop, anything that W3C does, we're going to have to incubate it first to make sure that we have the right stakeholders and that we pull together things in the right way. It's like cooking, right? You have to make sure all the ingredients are there, and you need to cook it at the right time for the right at the right temperature for the right time. But in addition to the things, first off, I want to say that I pretty strongly that identity is something that we've needed on the way. And identity means so many different things, but having some aspects of identity managed in the browsers is probably a really good fit, partly because it has this browser aspect. That's something user-facing. That's something that that sort of is in W3C's wheelhouse, user-facing technologies. Mm-hmm. Then there's other things I think that have come up a lot that are interesting, both in my conversations and in things that were submitted. But I think, the whole idea of interchange between ledgers, some sort of interchange format between blockchains or ledgers, is something that might fit into the data side of W3C pretty well. There's also the notion of sort of smart contracts or licenses, where rather than rely on something heavyweight like DRM, which you can put to some degree, say, access controls or access permissions on a blockchain, and that is a less I don't know, a less intrusive way of doing things around licensing media. That's something that I know some of our members are interested in, and some people outside W3C are interested in. I'm scanning here. One of the other things, like for example, IBM and several others have mentioned to me IoT, Internet of Things, and when you're talking about identity, there's a whole notion of this little device doing something on your behalf, perhaps, and doing something on your behalf, and and so you might need to delegate some of your identity to the identity of this device. And how is that going to be managed? And there's a lot of different questions that would fit into different topics that would fit into different parts of W3C. And then there's other things like the protocol, which protocol stuff usually belongs at IETF, and so we have a good partnership with them, and we would probably work with them on that. I think this is something that goes beyond W3C. It goes beyond IETF. It goes beyond standards. It's going to be something that's, I think there's a whole bunch of different things, and for W3C, some of the things that Daniel said and some of the other bits that I've just mentioned, I think are probably good topics to explore at the workshop.
Great, thank you, Doug. So one of the things that, oh, do you mind going on mute just for the feedback when you're not talking? Thanks. One of the things that you both said that I'll highlight is identity, and that's interesting. You know, at first blush, many people, I don't think all the chairs are even necessarily in agreement on anything. That's partly why we're having this exploratory workshop, I think, why you're doing that, to have a forum where, in an organized and a productive way, we can raise and vet and surface a lot of views, and then begin to see, if there may be a good fit. But identity is clearly not the first thing most people think of when you look at, like a Merkle tree for transactions on a ledger at all. And I didn't see it, I don't know, for maybe like a year after working with blockchain. I heard people talk about it for sure, Primavera and some of the other people that were initially showing me how to work with the stuff. I didn't understand it until really very recently, when thanks to people like Christopher Allen and people on this call and others, Sandy Pentland and Thomas Harjono, who submitted a paper from the Media Lab, and others, who walked me through how in principle you can have an address on a blockchain that we just declare represents an identifier of a person, identity, if you will, and kind of adhere different attributes or assertions to it, and it basically all lines up very nicely, and it's very interesting and intriguing way to begin to do it that could actually decouple. That could basically allow the source of the authority for asserting the identity for a person to be themselves. We hadn't had a system like that before, that is self-sourced in terms of the authoritative assertion about one's identity. Very interesting legally. The other thing that you mentioned, Doug, on smart contracts, very interesting. I know my own research here at the Media Lab is legal and policy oriented. So I run law.mit.edu, and we did a nice legal intensive on blockchains in this very room for the month of January. And I think there's a lot to that. That could be a great fit. Before we went live, Daniel and I were talking about web components. So that's a standard that is a W3C standard. So it's demonstrably a good example of one that you've worked on, and that's an example where that could revolutionize the law alone. Just being able to encapsulate contract clauses in a common way with the American Bar Association and judiciary and law schools and other stakeholders in that constellation, Thomson Reuters and others. But people with names who are known that can come to rooms and over a human period of time of a year or two could absolutely agree on even rudimentary ways to begin to describe in a common expected format when things are contracts, when they're referenced, how what templates look like, and begin to make these things reusable and discoverable and therefore analyzable. So when you crosswalk smart contracts to what can happen with a blockchain, and when you crosswalk identities of people that agree to terms to a blockchain and look at where the unique role of W3C is. I can't tell you right now exactly what the scope of a standard or committee should be, but it seems like a target-rich area to have good creative dialogue. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of color. And yeah, Doug, you had another insight?
Well, yeah, you gave me a thought. You gave me a thought that anything that we build at W3C, we hope to make low level enough that it combines with the other parts of the platform, and it's not just useful for blockchain. It's useful for a number of things across the board. And so those are really the things. I mean, you could say those are blockchain primitives, but they're actually really functional primitives that facilitate things in the blockchain and also facilitate other things. And I think the really exciting thing is that if we find a set of things that will work well with our standards, and that will work well in, say, a browser context, smart people, smart developers out there will combine these in ways we did not anticipate, and we'll have transformative effects on a number of industries because we will have enabled functionality. So it's just basic functionality that can be used in just a variety of ways. So
yeah, one thing I would add that's basically, follow up to that is, if you really think about identity, I think about web components and things like Houdini, which is the CSS groups, entrance into essentially the extensible web manifesto of let's give you these formerly black boxed hooks into how the platform operates that then you can use to do things like, for web components' sake, we could polyfill a new type of element that eventually could become a native element, right? We could do that now, and we can distribute it in a way that everyone can use it without third-party code. And that's hugely important, right? And I see the identity layer, the basic identity layer, as being that sort of building block, because what we're allowing you to do is create identity, global user-owned or object-owned identities that can stand for people or objects or interactions or places. And the cool thing there is it's very rudimentary. Like, we give you the ability to register these things. You own them, or the device owns them that it represents. And then from there, you kind of declare what you are to the world. And the cool thing about that is it's an open box. And what are people going to do with that? Well, I would hope that they use some sort of standard semantic to be able to communicate these representations. But there's so much it opens up. And I'll use the IoT example and extending to things that we've never thought of. Like right now, there was this big push to sort of make everything connected, right? We want to add Wi-Fi chips to our trash cans and to all these things in our house, and they're all going to be emitting signals and have to be plugged into power cords. But maybe we can do better, right? If you could create an identity for the trash, the publicly owned trash can that's down the street, or the section of road next to your house, or whatever it is, right? It gives you the ability to augment those things with crowdsourced data, and they actually have an identity in a way that you don't have to go microchip the world. You can just understand that it's referentially that thing being represented. So it actually unlocks, through identity, it unlocks all these potential use cases people may not think of as identity traditionally.
Mm-hmm. Here. And I guess one other big idea before we get more logistical is one of the best things. There's so many great things about the web, let's face it, but one of the best things is the way the addresses are construed. And so, like, the name of an address on the web it's a uniform resource locator generally, or it could be an identifier, but the word that the first two letters and words are the relevant concepts here: uniform, standard, common, and resource. Interesting. So like the R of resource, when you kind of break it right down, is very broad. It's hardly only a HTML page. Every REST interface and every calendar system and every everything you do that connects to something of value on the other side, and really all information is of some value, and some of it's much more valuable than others. And so as you go look at web banking and wallets and entertainment and education and resource allocation for public systems like trash pickup and public trash cans, there's a lot of value there, but who owns the resources? How do you access the value? How do we find it? How do we know that it hasn't changed? Some of the properties of blockchain could be a remarkable amplifier of the value of the web as a way to uniformly identify and access resources of value, including of individuals now at last. And another way to talk about a resource in the law is property. We think natural resources like Niagara Falls, or I don't know, like a big environmental resources, but fundamentally we're talking with digital assets about forms of property, and people have property, people have their diaries, we have all of the telemetry from our phones, we've got tons of digital assets, and probate and wills, we can see an increasing amount of people's worth are all these digital assets. At bankruptcy and merger and acquisition, when you add up all the worth of companies and you do valuation on them, increasingly we're talking about digital assets, and being able to, and so these resources and make them addressable are key, and finding an address on a blockchain and having that interoperate with the web, it's like peanut butter and chocolate, perhaps. So with that little big picture topic discussion, hopefully to get people's creative juices flowing a little bit, and also to begin to focus and narrow. I just wanted to focus in now on what's next. And so the next actions will be program committee tomorrow, right, and begin to narrow down the topics, and then we'll start really leading up to an agenda and ways people can participate. So Doug, if you'd like to have the last word, that would be good. And I'd like to just myself close by inviting people that won't be joining us in person, but who will be able to join on the web through because being at the Media Lab myself here, I have made a commitment to do at least some amount of video work, more if possible, but we'll be able to have some access to people can see what's going on for some of it, and to some extent we'll be able to maybe have some two-way interaction as well, either with forums or some other type of engagement. And here's the Hangouts. At the bottom of law.mit.edu/blockchain, which is where we're producing this Hangout series and making the archives available, there's a little form. And to keep it uncomplex and shareable, we just have a click for Creative Commons if you make a contribution, how we can find you on Gmail, and optionally what your thoughts are on what should be standardized, what could be standardized, good technologies we should be thinking about, and so forth. And so I invite people that would like to participate remotely to fill out that form. You can participate in our Hangouts next week. I think I'd like to produce more than one. And once we get the topics going, there's a lot of people that want to talk about their work, and we'll have quite a lot to say. And that includes mostly everybody out there in the big world with the emerging communities working on blockchain. So this is for you. Already invested the time to make it available, so go ahead and use it and get involved today. Sign up and join the conversation. So with that, Doug, can you bring us home?
Sure. So the next steps for anybody who's not on the program committee, I'm going to drop a link into the chat here, but you can find this through the, if you just Google W3C Blockchain Workshop and look for the expression of interest form. The deadline is today. If you are interested in participating, we do have more potential participants than we have space, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. But if you think that you can really add to the conversation, and it is going to be a conversation, then please, I encourage you to fill out the expression of interest form today to register your interest in participating. And early next week, we'll be sending out invitations, and we'll finalize who's actually going to be there and what the topics are. So those are the next steps, and we'll give you an update about that next week.
Awesome. And so here we have it inscribed in tangible video media, the URL that Doug mentioned. And when we say today, we mean today. This is the last day. So June 9th, 2016. It's a simple form. It's a fun form. Fill it out, and and have an identity in our workshop. So we're going to have another of these installments the same time, Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Once we have a program committee tomorrow, people will be excited. There'll be more to talk about. I will schedule more and work with Doug to get those on the workshop homepage, and we'll also be keeping up deeper information at law.mit.edu just on the Hangout part. So thanks, guys. That was terrific. It's such a pleasure to be working with you both on this, and I'm looking forward to working with you in more of an intensive in-person way when you come to the Media Lab. So thank you.
Great.
And
Thank you.
till next time, see you online. Bye.